In this lesson, we're looking at what philosophers call modality, which is a fancy term, and it's when philosophers use the term modality, they typically mean the study of possibility and necessity and contingency. And these terms, some of these terms are not going to be familiar to you, but we'll explain them throughout this lecture. So here's a review. Remember, propositions are either true or false, depending on how the world is. Most often, we're interested in finding out whether certain propositions are actually true. So scientists want to know if water actually freezes at 32F. And that is all we care about. We just care about whether or not it's actually true or false. But philosophers are also interested not only in the way things actually are, but in how things could be, which is basically what's possible, how things could not be, what's impossible, and how things must be, what is necessary. So things, we're going to use several examples throughout this lecture, but for example, here's something that could be the case, but currently isn't. It could be the case that the sky is red. It just so happens to be blue. It couldn't be the case that 2 plus 2 equals 5. And it has to be the case that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So that's just some ready examples of possible, impossible, and necessary. So in this unit, we're going to study what it means to say that a proposition is actually true or false, possibly true or false, or necessarily true or false. And this study of possibility and necessity is what philosophers and logicians call modality. And this is an introduction to what philosophers call modal logic, which is a discipline that's been around for quite a while, but got really rigorously developed in the 20th century. So here are 3 examples of clear-cut, necessarily true propositions. The first example is as follows. If there are any bachelors, then they are unmarried adult males. That is, it is impossible that there be a bachelor who is married. So we'll say that the proposition that all bachelors are unmarried adult males is necessarily true. Note, we're not saying that there must be bachelors in the world, or that the proposition that there are bachelors is necessarily true. Instead, our comment is a conditional. On the condition that someone is a bachelor, he must also be an unmarried adult male. So remember the lesson on arguments and on conceptual analysis? This is a conditional. It's basically part of the meaning of the word bachelor that it's an unmarried adult male. Being an adult male or unmarried is necessary for being a bachelor. This is conceptual analysis. So it's a conceptual truth. And conceptual truths are generally necessarily true. Actually, they're almost always necessarily true. So again, it's not that there are bachelors is necessarily true. And it's not that this particular guy over there is a bachelor is necessarily true. It's a conditional. If X is a bachelor, then X is unmarried. That's necessarily true. Which is good news for some of you. Alright. Second, 2 plus 3 equals 5 is necessarily true, as well as pretty much every other mathematical proposition. It's not that some days 2 plus 3 equals 5, and on other days 2 plus 3 is not 5. It's always going to be 5. And it's going to be true on Mars and on Earth. So if Joe has 2 apples and 3 pears, but Joe believes that 2 apples and 3 pears equals 29 pieces of fruit, that's not only false, but that's absurd. Third, though, there's also this what philosophers call essential properties. Now, essential properties are properties that objects have necessarily. The objects couldn't exist without those properties. For example, water is H2O. You take away hydrogen or an oxygen atom, it's not going to be water anymore. So these are the essential properties of water. Humans have kidneys and hearts. You take away a human heart, it's probably not going to be human. It's probably going to be a corpse. The number 2 has the essential property of being even, and it couldn't be anything other than even. It's not. Oh, my wife's calling me. 1 second. Sorry about that. Although I don't think I'm that sorry, because you got to hear my cool Ghostbusters ringtone. Which, by the way, if you haven't seen the original Ghostbusters movies from the 80s, shame on you, and go watch it now. May Harold Ramis, a.k.a. Egon Spengler, rest in peace. So anyways, water is H2O. 2 has the property of being even. It's not like 2 could have the property of being odd, ever, on any planet. The word 2 could refer to like the number 3, but then that would mean something different. But we're talking about the actual number 2, not the word 2. Alright, now let's talk about necessarily false propositions. So, in addition to there being ways the world must be, there are also ways the world cannot be. For example, it is impossible, as mentioned, that 2 is an odd number. It is impossible that a person is at the same time both a bachelor and married. And it is also impossible that 2 plus 3 equals 27. So in general, any proposition that denies or negates a necessarily true proposition is necessarily false and thus impossible. Well, now, there's this third class of propositions, and we've talked about necessarily true propositions, and we've also talked about impossible propositions. Now let's talk about contingently true propositions. So, aside from ways the world must be or must not be, philosophers are also interested in ways the world could be or could have been or could become. And one way to start is to ask how the world actually is. So, for example, the world is actually such a way that most fans of dragons are not as badass as the girl with the dragon tattoo. Alright? No offense to anyone that plays that game. It could be the case, so that fans of dragons in the real world are complete badasses. Just most aren't. But it could be different. It could be different in 10 years from now. Other examples. Davis is 5 feet 10 inches tall. The sun will rise tomorrow. The class meets online. Davis prefers eating Lucky Charms cereal to eating roasted squirrel. These are all true propositions, but they're contingent, which means they could be false. I could like roasted squirrel. None of these propositions are necessarily true because each of them, as I said, could be false. They are possibly false. So we call them contingently true propositions. For example, Davis could have been 5 feet 3 inches tall. I could have perhaps had a disease in early childhood that limited my growth. The sun could not rise tomorrow after all. We could nuke it and somehow prevent there from being a sun at all. This class could have been scheduled to meet in the classroom this semester. I could prefer roasted squirrel. That's why we say they're contingently true. Basically, it means that they're true, but it's possible that they're false. So philosophers say that these alternatives are metaphysically or logically possible. Where metaphysics is a fancy term which means it's the philosophical study of the ultimate nature of reality. And we're going to be doing that in this class. We're going to be doing a philosophical study of the ultimate nature of reality. Get ready. This is what we're studying in this class, and we're going to be doing it. And I'm actually serious. I'm not being facetious. So here's the question. Does God exist? If the answer to that question is yes or no, that's an answer to a question about the ultimate nature of reality. Alright, so when something's metaphysically or logically possible, that's to say that no logical or metaphysical principles would be violated if these propositions are actually true or false. So compare this to the logically impossible proposition that Davis is married and Davis is a bachelor. Suppose I'm married and I'm a bachelor at the same time. Well, to say that I'm married and that I'm a bachelor is to say that I'm married and I'm not married. But that's a contradiction. And so that's logically impossible. Contradictions are logically impossible. I can't be married and not married at the same time. That's not logically possible. There is no universe in existence, or possibly in existence, in which it could be true that I am married and not married at the same time. A proposition that is contingently false, on the other hand, is a proposition that is actually false, but possibly true. Britney Spears is not a rocket scientist, but it is not impossible. Justin Bieber has a high-pitched voice, but it is possible that his voice is as deep as James Earl Jones. So to say that these are contingently false is just to say that if they were true, they wouldn't violate any laws of metaphysics or logic. There would be no contradiction in them being true. Well, here's a question. Is a proposition there are round squares contingently false or necessarily false and thus impossible? Think on this. The answer is necessarily false. Because, well, it'd be a contradiction, I suppose. Well, we need to talk about some distinctions real quick. And it's important that we discuss these distinctions as well so you can grasp these concepts. Possible does not mean probable. Possibility does not come in degrees. Either something is possible or it is not. Probability, on the other hand, does come in degrees. Something is probable when its chance of being true is greater than 0. So two things, A and B, may be probable in that their chance of being true is greater than 0, but it could still be the case that A is more probable than B. Suppose A's probability is 20 and B's is 10. Possibility, though, does not come in degrees again. It's possible or not. So they are not the same thing. Here's an example. It's more improbable than probable that the NFL will change the rules such that the players throw babies instead of footballs this year. This does not mean that it is impossible that the NFL will change the rules. It just means that, because that would imply that there's a contradiction involved. It just means that it's not likely, it's not probable. I wouldn't bet on it, which is good for babies. All right, there's another distinction. There's epistemic versus metaphysical possibility. What in the world do those two terms mean? Epistemic means to know, basically. Knowledge versus, it's the study of knowledge. Actually, we're going to spend a week or two studying the field of epistemology this semester. And it's basically, it's a fancy term for knowledge. It's the study of knowledge. And so let me elaborate. Something may be possible given your knowledge, but actually be metaphysically impossible. So it is epistemically possible, for all Bob knows, that 598 times 890 is 569,873. However, it's not logically or metaphysically possible because the actual answer is 532,220. I calculated that in my head, if you were wondering. Remember, mathematical truths are necessarily true or false. Or necessarily true, I mean. Well, here's another possibility of a statement of, here's another example of a statement of epistemic possibility. For all I know, there was someone in that chair. Another example of a statement of epistemic possibility. For all I know, there was someone in that chair. Remember that? All right. Okay, let's wrap up this unit, this set lesson with a review then. A necessarily true proposition is a proposition that is actually true and cannot be false. A necessarily false proposition is a proposition that is actually false and cannot be true. A contingently true proposition is a proposition that is actually true but could be false. And a contingently false proposition is a proposition that is actually false but could be true. Again, these PowerPoint slides will be available on the Blackboard website, and I highly encourage you to download it and study them to help you absorb this information. All right, well, how do we determine necessity and contingency? Well, some propositions can be known to be true or false simply by understanding the meaning of the words in the sentence that express them. Philosophers call these sentences analytic. Examples of a true proposition: all sisters are females. You don't need to set up a lab or meet all sisters in the world to know that sisters are also females. Instead, one just needs to know the meaning of the word sister, and then you'll know. But by that if something is a sister, then that thing is a female. So this is important. Any proposition expressed by an analytic sentence is necessarily true. Well, any sentence that expresses a proposition and is not analytic is what philosophers call synthetic. These are sentences that must be known to be true by some other means than just examining the meaning of the words. So here's an example. Davis has 5 fingers on his left hand. You actually have to check my hand to know if I have 5 fingers and know if that sentence is true. You can't just think about the meaning of Davis's hand and 5 fingers and then see, okay? Well, so then recall, any proposition expressed by an analytic sentence is necessarily true, but that does not mean that all propositions by contingent sentences are only contingently true. Another example, every event has a cause. Many philosophers think that that is a synthetic sentence. It's not a part in the meaning of the word event that it have a cause. But if that is true, it would be necessarily true. So a true proposition expressed by a synthetic sentence may be only contingently true, or it might be necessarily true. To find out, you have to inspect the world in many cases. For example, water is H2O. Most philosophers think that that is necessarily true, that H2O is a list of essential properties of water. But we didn't learn that by thinking about the meaning of the term water. We had to do some chemistry and discover the chemical constitution of it. However, you can't determine if the proposition is necessarily true by examining the meanings of the words of the sentence used to express it, nor by merely inspecting the world. To find out if a proposition expressed by a synthetic statement is necessarily true, you actually have to turn to a tool used by philosophers today, which we'll present soon.